Good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock, and I think we'll get started. My name is Jim Stordahl. I'm an extension educator. Right now, I'm in Clearwater County in beautiful Bagley on a stormy night. So thank you, everyone, for coming out. And I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. Jake Overgaard is an extension educator in the Banana Belt of Minnesota in Winona, and he will be presenting tonight from the Winona location, and will be presenting information on starting your own orchard. And Jake has a wealth of information, not only academically, but has had a great deal of experience in working on an orchard in southern Minnesota and Wisconsin. So he will bring a wealth of knowledge to us tonight. So I think everybody, hopefully all the locations are ready. So with that, Jake, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Jim. I hope everybody can hear me all right. Let me know if audio is poor. I've been kind of talking all day, so if my voice starts failing, I apologize for that. I might have to clear a throat here and there. But like Jim said, I've got a little experience in apple production. I worked on a organic fruit farm here in Winona County for a few seasons and got a lot of experience there, as well as through some of my studies. So I'm kind of looking forward to this presentation and sharing this information with all of you up north. I've got to say, it is kind of nice down here in the Banana Belt, as Jim says. It's kind of, you go one, USDA hardiness zone down, and it opens up a lot of options. So I know that there's a lot of challenges up there. I'm actually from the Otter County, and I spent some time up at Bemidji State as well. So I've got my heart's a little bit up north, but I'm enjoying the hardiness zone down here. So I guess I'll dive right into it. That should be up now. So just kind of going through a little bit of what I'll be covering in this section. We'll be going through the site selection and preparation. We'll look at different ways to have a layout in your orchard. I'll talk a little bit about cultivars and rootstock. We'll talk, a little bit about grafting. It's a little bit advanced, but we'll cover it a little bit. Training of trees, thinning, integrated pest management, both for disease as well as insects and mammals as well. I'll mention pruning a little bit, talk some about marketing, as well as budgets and integrating animals. I guess as all the presenters find, it's a little bit challenging presenting to an audience with a wide range of experience, but I'm hoping to give information that's applicable for both small producers that just want to have half a dozen trees or a dozen trees in their backyard or somewhere on their land, up to somebody that's looking to go into a little bit more of a commercial production. So kind of like as Ben Artz covered at the beginning of our sessions, it's important to kind of think about what your goals are and where you want to go with your production. Are you just growing for yourself and your own consumption or your family's consumption? Are you looking to supplement your income a little bit, or are you looking at it as a main income for your operation? So thinking of those things, they're definitely very important when you start considering what kind of scale you'd like to set up. So if you're talking about just for yourself, your facilities are going to be different. The equipment that you have is going to be very different. When you go up to an operation that is aimed at providing you with all or most of your income, you're going to be looking at cooler space, a lot more equipment, a little bit more advanced spraying equipment. So it definitely changes things. So be thinking of that as I talk about apple production and what kind of scale you're interested in producing at. Actually, I think I'm gonna have everybody kind of do the initial discussion, the number one activity on the sheet that should be in those sites. So I guess as a group, kind of think about and talk about what scale you're interested in producing. Is it for consumption and maybe a little bit of storage and not necessarily as a business? I put business in quotations. Are you looking at, of course, consumption storage and maybe some direct sales? Or are you looking at a little bit larger in that realm, or possibly looking at multiple markets with some wholesale, possibly selling to restaurants or local co-ops? And what kind of advantages or disadvantages do you see in the production of apples that you have experienced or that you can foresee just now with whatever knowledge you may have? So we can take about 10 minutes and you can kind of talk about that amongst your group, and then I'd kind of like to hear from a few sites if you can find somebody to be your reporter and just share with the rest of us what kind of things were covered for you. Okay, have at it. Well, I think we'll get going with Linda, if your site could kind of fill me in on what was discussed there or what came up and kind of the main issues that you heard.
Yep, we have a spokesperson.
Great.
Okay, so several of us are wondering about growing organically. Very interested in that. And also wondering about the benefits of growing dwarf varieties versus full size. Apple varieties that don't freeze back in the winter. Making hard cider and vinegars. And I think that might be it.
Okay, great. How about your group, Jim? What do you guys got?
Hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Most of our people here were looking at apple for the home use. A few were interested in selling a certain, some extra if they had them. So, the things we basically talked about was, the hardiness aspect up here in zone 2-3. Doing a little bit of grafting. I think you're going to cover at least part of that. I think them were the major things. We just took a little bit of time to get acquainted.
Sure, good. What's any other sites want to volunteer any feedback?
We've got some information here at Staples,
Okay.
and our group is mainly going to be growing it for our own personal use, but a lot of the growers are concerned about the durability. The Honeycrisp has got such a high mortality rate. The other thing was the prevalence of fire blight up in this area and disease.
Sure.
So if you could cover that, I think the rest of it was, we're not a real bad as far as insects or, the codlin moth or apple maggot or any of that, but.
Sure.
About it for now.
Majority of it, yeah.
Well, that's good. I will be definitely talking a little bit about organic production, some of the discussion on dwarf rootstock, as well as some varieties. I won't get too much into the processing or hard cider, but I know that it's kind of a neat option, and definitely has a good price out there if you can find a market. Hardiness and variety selection and diseases are all things that I'll be talking about. So I appreciate getting that information from everybody, and we'll move on.
We haven't heard from Crookston yet.
Oh, Crookston.
Crookston wants to say
Does
something.
anybody else want to talk?
Yeah, I guess most of us would be for personal use, but we've had apple trees for a few years. Our biggest concern has been fungal diseases.
Okay.
We're getting diseased out.
Do you know what you have?
What type of disease?
Yeah.
No, I don't know what type. I know it's a fungal disease, but I don't know what type.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay.
Is there any other site that's eager to kind of have their input heard?
Well, this is Baudette.
Yeah.
Hardiness, varieties that are hardy up here. And then we've had some comments about apple trees and planting from seeds and whether they do come true. And then worms in the apples. Sure.
Great. Well, I'm glad to hear the issues, and it kind of supports what I'll be talking about. So I'm glad I'm going the right direction, I believe. So I'll stop periodically, and we can answer some questions, and I'll definitely leave some time at the end to answer some questions as well. So I'll just kind of jump into it. So there's that. So this would be problematic. That was a bad ice storm, and we definitely don't want that to happen. When it gets to that point, there's probably nothing you can do about it, but definitely a situation we don't want happening on our orchard. So talking about site selection, if you bring nothing home tonight, let it be that don't plant in a valley or a low spot. I think as we think about where we're growing and what we're growing, especially up north, and it's even an issue in this area of the state and other areas of the country. If you plant in a low spot, that's where that cold air is going to drop in the evening, and you're going to have a frost issue. And if you're getting a bloom at that time, and the apple trees are susceptible to frost, it's gonna spell failure for your production. So if you can plant on a hillside, that's definitely gonna help so that you have some air drainage. We're also talking about, we don't want to be in an area that's super heavy clay, that water is pooling up quite a bit. That'll cause problems, as with just about any other agricultural production. Like I said, have a slight slope. If you have any unmanaged apple trees, including crab apples, you definitely, that's going to spell problems for you, just because you'll have more disease, you'll have more insects. Those unmanaged trees will harbor pests and diseases and spread them to yours. This is an issue that we saw on the farm that I was working at. We had very careful pest management practices going on, but there were some neighboring lands that just had trees just across the road that weren't being managed, and we had some pretty substantial pest pressures just coming from that. Also, red cedars are an issue. There's a disease called cedar apple rust that will afflict apple trees, and it kind of has two hosts, and one of the hosts is red cedars. So if we're able to eliminate any red cedars from the site, that breaks up the disease cycle, and we won't see as much cedar apple rust. Now, orientation, in that respect, I'm talking about north, south, east, west. What side of which direction is your planting facing? For that area of the country, I'd probably recommend a westerly facing slope if you can. If you have a south facing slope, it might warm up a little bit too fast, and you might get a bloom that's a little bit early, and will be a better chance of getting a frost there. On the east side, it tends to be a little bit too cool almost, and if you're able to get onto the west side, it kind of, it meets that kind of happy medium. If you have a site where there's no other option, you can try it and see what happens. I know that where I've worked, we're up in bluff country, so we've got lots of ridges and different hills, and it's a little bit easier here, but we've been a little bit strategic about what we've planted. We're actually able to do some apricots down here, and we've put those on the north side of a slope, just because they'll handle a little bit cooler weather, and they won't warm up as fast and bloom as quickly. So being strategic about how you set up your orchard or any kind of planting is is important. And then another disease that has to do site selection is apple replant disease. If you're planting in an orchard that had been an orchard for a very long time, and if the trees were removed, reestablishing an orchard in there will be really difficult. There's a lot of studies on this disease, and they don't have it perfectly figured out. But the issue becomes that there's too many, I guess, microorganisms or pathogens in the soil that can affect the trees. And if you're planting new trees, they won't be able to defend themselves against that kind of battalion of microorganisms. So that's important as well. Looking at site preparation, if you have time, it's always good to be able to kind of spend a year cover cropping or multiple years. I think that starting with a Sudan hybrids, I'll show you a picture of that. So if you want to choke some weeds out, this stuff is pretty good. There's not much light hitting that ground, and it really establishes quite well. And you can actually do multiple cuttings through a year, in a year. And actually, if you cut it when it's 4 feet or so, it'll actually root further down into the ground and can help a little bit in breaking up any kind of hard pan or loosen the soil, as well as pull up some nutrients from lower down in the soil horizons and help feed your apple trees. And it's obviously a great source of organic matter as well. So you could plant that. It does very well in warm temperatures. So through July it will grow kind of like mad. At that point you could follow it with some buckwheat or possibly some orchard grass and clover. Or another option would be kind of a bluegrass or with a mix of creeping red fescue. Those actually handle drought pretty well, and they won't be as vigorous. They'll stop their growth when it's completely dry. I actually, I support having a mix of different species on your ground cover, just because it provides a little bit more of a habitat and food source for some of the natural enemies of insects, pests that you might have. So in the second year, you'd like to take a soil sample. Either do that in late fall when soil temperatures there are down below 50 degrees, or in early spring, and then till your planting strip apply any kind of fertilizer that might be necessary. In the resource guide, I've included a document that's available online that is the nutrient management for commercial fruit and vegetable crops in Minnesota. It's a really good source for, of course, apples, but also any of the vegetables that Terry would have talked about last week. So that's a really good resource, and that has information on apple fertility. So that's there. And then you'd want to till a strip 2 to 4 feet, probably closer to 4 feet, and get those trees in the ground. Planting trees, the earlier you can get in there, the better. Mid-April to mid-May is best. Up in that area, I'd skirt closer to May. If you have dormant trees, if you've bought bare rootstock trees or bare root trees, try and keep them cool and the roots moist while you're out there. Don't let them dry out. And then various methods of planting, of course. There's the tried and true shovel. There's the soil auger if you've got a lot of holes to dig, and if you're putting a substantial number of trees, this might be a nice thing to be able to use and save some time and labor. And some people even get that tractor-mounted tree planter out there and move along pretty quickly. So there's a number of different options for that. When you look at how deep you plant your trees, the graft union, and I'll get a little bit more into the scion and what the rootstock is, but just remember that you want your graft union above above the soil of a few inches, probably at least 3 inches. If it gets down below, you're going to have a different tree growing actually than you had planned on. And then just consider that the soil will be settling. When you do plant, most people are going to use a central leader system. So that's having one main stem of the tree and then offshoots of that. So you've got a strong stem that can support the rest of the branches that are on the tree. Choose that single leader. Remove any side branches that are 50% the diameter of the trunk. And also you'll want to set up a support system, especially if you're doing dwarfing trees. Some of the rootstock is a little bit brittle and they can actually flow over or simply break at that union. So having a stake in there or setting up a trellis system, where I've worked, we've used both systems. We do a lot of staking, but we also use a lot of high tensile steel wire that runs through the rows, and you can kind of clip the trees onto that, and that gives it a lot of needed support. Ag lock is, if you can kind of see the lower photo, it's got a kind of a black rubber band almost. It's kind of a nice, more or less made for this purpose, and you don't want to put it too tight against a pole. You can use T-stakes, metal T-stakes, but you don't want it too tight because it will rub up against there, and that can damage the tree. You want to put some tree guards on, and that will protect against sun scald, which is when the tree will warm up a little bit too much and it'll start flowing. Some of the phloem and vascular tissue will start running some things, and you'll have issues as it gets colder. Rabbits and mice, it will protect against them. They're kind of the bane of the orchardist, and if you will be applying any herbicide, it'll protect against that as well. Interestingly, the rabbits and mice can be really bad, and you can see how it kind of in a loop goes around, and you'll have a little bit of a crack. And I actually saw some of the mice just followed that line where there's that tiny little gap, and they girdle a tree. So it will protect a little bit, but there's some other things that you can do to protect against them as well. It can provide a refuge for dogwood borer. However, the advantages definitely outweigh the different issues that you might see with tree guard. All right, if you're going to get that orchard going, you're probably going to want some water. If you can depend on rain, that's great, and sometimes you can, but if you're able to get any kind of irrigation system, or if you're out there watering with a soaker hose, that will really improve your initial production. So in the summertime, you'll benefit from keeping the row of the trees, especially in a new planting, weed free. You can use a Roundup. There's a couple of other herbicides. You can cultivate, you can flame, you can mulch, you can use pre-emergent herbicides. Where I worked, it was an organic orchard, so we didn't use any herbicides, but we did use some cultivation, and I think I have a photo coming up. So that's an option for cultivation. That's actually called a weed badger. There's a number of different models, and this actually goes in and out of the row and tills up that strip around the trees. It's pretty easy to take out a tree with one of these. I've done it. But I think I actually did it less than my boss did, so I felt good about that. So that's an option. I actually, I'll get more into that a little bit later on. So I kind of covered that. So in the first few years, you don't really have to worry too much about insect and disease control. You can definitely be out there walking your orchard and seeing if anything is coming up. But you don't necessarily need to start employing any controls, since you're probably not getting much or any fruit. Summer maintenance, you've got a couple of options here in terms of fruit. You can actually remove the fruit in the first few years, and you'll get a little bit better vegetative growth, and you'll have a stronger tree. If you're doing that, you'll probably want to start doing some training, and that is, as you can see in the photo with the photo below there, you can put kind of, I guess, braces in there so that the tree spreads out nicely and will have fruit-producing branches, or not. If you have a lot of trees, honestly, I think that it can get to be a lot of work. And if you let those trees bear, they'll actually, because of the fruit hanging on the branches, they'll pull them down a little bit, and that will kind of force them to be spread out. As well as, while you're pruning, you want to be selecting trees that go horizontally and not vertically, so you can do what you want there. So getting a little bit more into orchard floor management, one of your options is to mulch. I really like the idea of mulching, but don't use straw. That is pretty much just bedding for mice and voles, and you'll have some pretty serious issues there. I did a farm visit down near Decorah, Iowa, a couple summers ago, and they were actually managing their orchard entirely with mulch, and they just put out about 4 or 5 inches of mulch around the trees, and that's how they were doing it. So he had gotten a bunch of wood chips from, I think, the county mulch site or something like that, and was applying that. So if you have that availability, I think it's a good option. You definitely still need to continue applying that mulch throughout the years. It's not going to be one application, because it'll start breaking down a little bit, and you'll get some weeds and grass coming up through there. You can use herbicides. As I said, you can flame, steam, or hand weed. Also mowing, you can just mow it. It won't have as much vigorous growth. However, if these other mechanisms aren't an option, you can do that. You can do the cultivation like I showed you with the weed badger or the Swiss sandwich. There's a couple of different methods. With cultivation, you can go, I guess, between the trees or just beside the tree. The Swiss sandwich is when you just go beside this tree, and there's a kind of a strip of grass that grows up through there, and people have found some success with that. I'm going to actually reference you to the Cornell guide on apple production. That has a really good discussion on different models of equipment and different options for growers. And that's on your resource list. That's available online for free. It's a really good guide, so I recommend looking into that a little bit. I guess I'll stop for just a minute and see if I could take a couple, maybe 2 or 3 questions that people might have at this point. Kind of went through a bunch kind of fast. So if there's any burning questions, does anybody have anything that they'd like a little bit more detail on?
Do we have to do something maybe? I have a question on spacing. How do you space the rows and the trees in the rows? And then I guess it probably depends on what rootstock you're using. Are you going to
Yep.
that?
Yeah, you definitely want to consider what rootstock you're using, and you can find, I think, in at least some of these guides, there's some information on spacing, and you really want to consider, of course, what rootstock and what size of tree you're going to have, and then the second consideration would be what kind of equipment do you need to be moving through there. Do you have what they would refer to as an orchard tractor that is pretty small and fits through there, or does your equipment, need 12 to 15 feet of spacing? And also consider if you're on a slope and if you have some wet ground and you're going to be sliding around, you might want a little bit of extra as well. So that kind of depends on on what you're growing and what kind of equipment you have. That's what I would look at. So it depends. Great answer, right?
Question from Bagley.
Yeah.
You had mentioned to remove the fruit for the first couple of years.
Yeah.
At what stage does it make any difference when you remove it, when you just got the bud, you wait till it flowers, you wait till it sets fruit, or does it make any difference at all?
The sooner you do it, I would say the better. That will let the tree put more resources into the vegetative production. But you know, if you got it mid-season, it wouldn't be too big of a deal. Obviously, if you wait until fall, you're picking apples at that point. So the earlier the better, I guess. You know, once you're able to see that there's fruit set on there. There are actually some chemical options, both organic and conventional, that you could use for that. I know that some people use lime sulfur to thin apples, and that's relatively effective depending on the variety. That's getting a little bit more advanced, but yeah. Maybe one more question from any site, I guess.
One more from Bagley.
Yeah, have at it.
You referred to mulch, but don't use straw. What materials are you thinking of? Wood chips is one.
Yeah.
Did you have any others?
I'd look at wood chips. That's, I don't know. I know that some people have actually have done rock, actually. If I can reference, let's see, the Organic Apple Grower, let's see where that is on the list. They reference using rocks. Michael Phillips' book, The Apple Grower, A Guide for the Organic Orchardist, that's on the second page of the reference list. He talks a little bit about using rock mulch in his orchard, so that might be another option. The only thing with that is that in terms of a material that's available, that might be a little bit more difficult to obtain, and it'd be even more heavy to haul, so that might be an issue. All right, I'm gonna dive back in for a little bit, and I'll take a few questions a little bit later on.
Would it be really ridiculous just to use a wood chipper to make your own wood chips?
That'd be fantastic. Yeah, you could do that.
So I'm not just piling pathogens on top of a tree now. If I use a wood chipper, that's okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. All right. So thinking about cultivars, when we say cultivar, we're talking about a variety that's cultivated. So cultivar, they got fancy with that one. So what should you look for? Obviously, we're up north. It's cold. Hardiness. Now, I don't have a great extensive list that lists out all the characteristics that you might look for. I'd love it if I had one, actually. I should work on one of those. But, you know, pick a tree that's hardy for your zone. If you try and stretch it and grow something out of zone 4 or zone 5, you're almost doomed to failure. So please choose a hardy variety. Also, you want to match to your use. For example, there's a lot of actually pretty decent apple scab resistant varieties out there that I actually really like them in terms of taste, but if you're looking to market apples, you're going to have to spend a lot more time in that marketing. So you might want to choose a variety that's a little bit more marketable. Obviously, you choose what you like. I have apples that I would probably never grow just because I really like eating apples, and if I don't like it, I'm not going to grow it, even if I can sell it. If I'm any kind of snob, I'm an apple snob. So if you look at, I tapped a guy at one of the tech colleges up there. He teaches on specialty fruits, Thaddeus McManus, and he gave some recommendations of apples that have done well in that kind of northern area, and within that list are Zestar, Zestar's a great summer apple. Where I was working, we had a number of summer apples that are ready, middle of August or early August, and they're okay. I mean, it's that first apple, and they're decent. But then when the Zestars come, and they're the best tasting early apple out there, as far as I'm concerned, that you can grow in Minnesota. And I think last year, I had to tell my boss, the first time I bit into a Zestar this past summer, it actually it forced me to cuss a little bit because it was just so good. So Zestar, Honeycrisp, Harrelson, Duchess is a good variety for that area. Centennial crabs. I look into crab apples are really quite tasty, and those can be somewhat marketable as well. Macintosh does okay up there. I'm not a big fan of Macintosh apples in terms of flavor, but some people are. You might have luck growing them. They are a little bit susceptible to scab, so there's issues there. Empire, and then Sweet Tango. Sweet Tango is the newest University of Minnesota variety. However, being able to grow it, there are some restrictions. Minnesota growers can grow 1,000, and there's some payments that people have to make in order to grow it, and legal issues. So it's a little bit more restrictive in its availability. And then, as I mentioned, the scab-resistant varieties are good options, especially if you're an individual that's looking to grow apples for your own production. There's some really good scab-resistant varieties out there that you won't have to spray at all. You won't have to worry about scab if that's prevalent in your area. So I would actually really recommend those if that's something you're interested in. And then you also need to be thinking about pollination. Most apple varieties are not self-fertile, meaning that they won't fertilize themselves and produce a fruit unless there's another variety whose pollen gets to their flowers via wind or bee. So you need to have a few varieties growing in your area in order to get pollination. So what some people do is they alternate rows. So one row of Harrelson, one row of, for example, Honeycrisp, and then the pollen will be getting back and forth. Other people will put one tree of one variety on the end of a row of another variety, and that can be enough. And then just encouraging those pollinators, the native bees as well as honeybees, providing habitat for them, and trying either not to use insecticides that will kill them, or spraying at times when they're generally not out foraging, like in the evening. That's an important thing to consider as well. So what I've done is you can go to your local nurseries and see what's available there. There's also quite a number of nurseries around the country that have websites that have lots of information and availability to buy either one or two trees up to thousands of trees. So there's a number of different ordering options. So I would definitely recommend visit your local nursery if you're looking to buy a few trees. If you're looking for a really specific variety and a really specific rootstock, start doing some online searching, and you'll find some information through that. Getting on to rootstock, we had a question, or somebody was interested about the benefits of a dwarfing rootstock, and you'll see here a listing and a size chart that shows the different dwarf rootstock available and its relative size to a seedling apple. Now, let's see. So dwarfing rootstock this is kind of a fuzzy picture, but on the top you have your scion. That's the variety that you're producing fruit with. So your scion is either a Harrelson, it's a Honeycrisp, it's a Sweet Tango, and then below it's grafted onto a rootstock, which is what generally controls the size of the tree as well as some other different characteristics. So I just want to repeat what I said at the beginning when we were talking about planting trees. You don't want to bury that graft union, because if you bury that graft union, you'll get some roots coming out of the scion, and you will no longer have a Harrelson on B9 rootstock, but you'll just have a Harrelson seedling, and that tree will become probably larger than you had anticipated. So there's a lot of different rootstocks out there available. B9, all the rootstocks have a letter and then a number. The letter stands for wherever the rootstock came from or where it was developed. So you have B is Budowski, M is Mailing, the O is Ottawa. There's a number of different ones out there. And so B9 does pretty well. Let's see, where did I have that? In northern Minnesota, I wouldn't, again, this is from Thaddeus, who's at a tech college up in that area. I wouldn't put Honeycrisp on a B9. Honeycrisp is not all that much of it's not a very vigorous tree in the first place. And B9 is a very dwarfing rootstock. You'll get a tree that's about 8 to 10 feet tall. So if you put a Honeycrisp on a B9 in northern Minnesota, it's just not going to grow that well. So an option there would be to use Columbia Crab with Honeycrisp, Antonovka, or B118. B118 will be a little bit larger. I don't know if that's on here, but that'll be about 75% of your vigor, and with a Honeycrisp it'll probably drop it down to about 50%. So you'll get a decent sized tree, and it'll work pretty well there. Otherwise, in general, B9 is good. It's a pretty hardy rootstock and has some other disease resistance characteristics. Also, M26 is good, and as mentioned before, B118. So as you're looking through catalogs or talking to the people at your nursery, those are the things that are good options for you. And rootstock isn't all about dwarfing. There can be some virus resistance as well as fire blight resistance. So for those of you who are talking about having fire blight in your area, look for a rootstock that is fire blight resistant. I believe B9 actually has some pretty good resistance. Precocity, that's just talking about how soon it will bear fruit. So some will bear fruit and do it better earlier. As well as brittleness and support needs. There are some rootstocks that are a little bit more brittle, and they'll need a little bit, you'll definitely need to have them staked or trellised in some way. And then some are more or less vigorous. I don't know if this made it onto your slides. I might have put this in afterwards, but at extension.org there's a section on apples that has a really good discussion on rootstock that I would recommend. They go into a little bit more detail. They talk a little bit more about characteristics of different rootstocks. So if you have more questions on that, I would recommend that site. So, as I said, local garden centers, online nurseries. I also recommend that people experiment a little. If you have time to put a tree in the ground and see what it does on your site, and try a few different varieties on a few different rootstocks and see how it does in your soil and in your conditions, that's a great thing to do, just to really know how it will perform where you're at. And then, of course, what are your neighbors growing? Spy on them a little bit. I'll go a few more slides and then we'll get to some more questions. So thinning. Thinning is important. So when I talk about thinning, that's removing some of the apples off of the tree, and you do it to encourage the apples to become larger. You do it to prevent biennial bearing, especially in apples like Honeycrisp. What will happen is you'll have a year where the trees will flower like mad. You'll have, all kinds of fruit on there, and if you don't thin, the next year it won't bear at all. You'll get no flowering, and that can be an issue. So if you thin, and especially within the right timeline, that can prevent some of that. Sometimes it does still happen, but at least you've done your best to prevent it. You can also thin to kind of help your predators. I guess, no, not that one, this one. So if you have kind of two apples that are hanging on the tree like this together, and you have this kind of space between apples, that's actually an area for insects to hide and provide some refuge. So if you're able to just thin that down to one apple, you've removed that refuge for them. So that's another advantage of thinning. Also, you can remove any damaged fruit. As I've been thinning, I'm generally looking for anything that has, some precursors of apple scab, or possibly codling moth damage or plum curculio damage, and you can remove that fruit and keep the fruit that's larger. You can do it mechanically or with chemicals. As I mentioned before, there are options for both organic and conventional growers. When I talk about mechanically, that's by hand. So you're out there with small pruners or just with your hands, and what you do is you remove apples until you have one apple per cluster. So apples will grow in clusters, and you'll have probably 5 apples growing on one cluster. So remove 4 of those apples, leave one, preferably the largest one, or the one that doesn't have any damage or disease on it. And then you leave roughly a fist length, depending on the size of your fist. So roughly 6 inches between each of those clusters. It's kind of slow at first, but once you get some practice, you can be a pretty speedy thinner. You want to do it somewhere in between the fruit set and flower initiation, and you can do it a little bit later, and that's fine, but in order to kind of prevent the biennial bearing, you want to do it as soon as possible once you have that fruit set. So roughly 1/2 inch of a fruit size. And then, as I said, they're especially on Harrelson and Honeycrisp. Those are 2 varieties that are kind of classic biennial bearers. Pruning. Please do it. I'm not going to go too deep into pruning. I've actually, on your resource list, let's see where it is. On the second page, apple tree pruning, second from the bottom. It's actually a YouTube video from Colorado State. They do a pretty good job of explaining it. I'm not going to try and get too far into it on an ITV situation. That sounds disastrous to me. So check out that video if you can get online. They explain pretty well what the difference between different buds on the tree, what's a leaf bud and what's actually going to produce some fruit. So there's a really good explanation of that, and also how to approach a tree. In general, you want to do it, of course, to get the kind of structure you want. If you want that central leader, you're going to need to prune to encourage that. You also want to encourage good air movement, so not having a million branches in there with a million leaves will help the air move around a little bit more and will prevent some of the issues you might get with fungal diseases, especially apple scab, as well as any of the summer fungus diseases that are out there, and to improve productivity. So in general, you want to remove any dead or diseased branches, take out any suckers at the crown or just at the base of the tree, as well as within the tree as well. Taking out any branches. I just want to caution people, don't cut super close to the tree, you can start digging in there and start doing some damage to the tree itself. But you don't want to, leave half a branch because you're scared of doing that. So, leave an inch or 2 inches and you'll be fine. I guess we generally take some breaks here. So I'll take a few questions. Well, let's see. Wait a second. I got another slide. So remove any branches that are competing with the main stem. If you have any branches that are shooting up kind of parallel with your vertical central leader, take any of those out. Use a sharp tool. If you can, get out there and prune every year, especially for organic growers. Having that open canopy will really aid in your production. And I've also included, I'm not sure if it made it on the resource list, this website from Cornell. They have a really good explanation of how to prune, and then the Colorado State YouTube video. So at this point I will take some questions, maybe 2 or 3, and then we'll bump off to a quick break and we'll get back into it.
Couple of questions for you. First of all, one thing that came up, we got a stump grinder, and someone was saying that using the white wood when you grind out a stump as mulch is not a good idea. Any thoughts on that?
Any reason why was that thought? I guess I'm not sure. I think that'd be fine. You wouldn't want to use a stump of a tree that was infected with fire blight. If it was another apple tree, that might cause some issues. But if you're gonna mulch that up, I don't think it'd be much of an issue, unless there's something that I don't know.
Okay. The other question: when you're looking at apple trees, and usually I go to the local greenhouse. They got cold storage, and they're either bare root or they're in a basket in a tub. Kinds are from Bailey's. That seems to be common, but I never see anything hanging on the tree about what kind of rootstock it has. How do you find that out?
That's a good question. You really got to press those nursery owners and ask them. Otherwise, if you're just getting a tree, really, before I started studying apples and getting all involved in apples, if you had said rootstock to me, I'd had no idea what you're talking about. So, ask them. Make sure that they're able to tell you. If they can't tell you, don't buy it. That'd be my recommendation. Other questions out there?
Have you ever heard of a Siberian rootstock tree? Siberian?
What is it again? Can you repeat that, please?
I attended a lesson at one time at Perham on rootstocks of apples, and they had a Siberian rootstock. And I've got the tree a-growing.
Yeah.
And it won't produce apples, but it's very, very hardy rootstock. Have you ever come across something like that?
You could have a variety of issues. It could be something to do with fertility, the apple variety. If there's not another apple tree of a different variety, you might not have any pollination going on. It could be an issue of a variety of things. So it's kind of hard to answer that question without some more information.
From Staples here?
Yeah.
If the main part of a tree died and you had 1 or 2 suckers that growing up along the side,
yep,
would that produce any fruit in the future or not? I've heard pros and cons never will.
It depends on what the sucker is. If the sucker is from the variety that you planted, what will probably happen there, if it's still on the rootstock, you might eventually get a good tree. Your other option is, if you know that it's the rootstock that's sending up a sucker, and you can actually identify that sometimes, especially with B9. B9 actually has a reddish color to the stem has a different color than regular trees, and you can identify it. And if you can get that sucker, eliminate it down to the biggest one, and then you can graft onto that sucker that's coming up. So if you had a B9, you could throw a Harrelson on there, and then you've got an apple.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have a question.
Yeah.
From Bemidji?
Yeah.
Have you had any experience or heard about people planting other things than just apples? Like, is there an advantage to planting cover crops in there or plums alongside them?
You know, kind of having an integrated orchard is a good thing. At the same time, if it's going to be on a larger scale, it becomes difficult just for harvest. You know, if you're trying to alternate trees or having a lot of varieties in one row, that can get kind of confusing when it comes time to pick. You can get kind of good at identifying apples, but sometimes between some varieties it's kind of difficult. If you have, sorry, go ahead. Were you going to say something? Okay, sorry. So yeah, it kind of depends on what scale you have. If you want to, if it's, you know, a smaller block and not a whole lot of trees, you can put some different things in there. It just becomes difficult when you're, like I said, if you're harvesting or any kind of management that would be specific to certain varieties or species. It can get a little bit tricky. So you can kind of, again, it's that depends answer that is so fun. Let's do one more question. We'll take a quick break.
I have a lone apple tree that bears really well every year.
Yeah.
And the closest any other apple trees are to it, I have some red splendor crab from a CRP planting that's probably a half mile away. So how is that getting pollinated, or how is it yielding like that?
That could actually be a bee. Bees will travel up to that distance, and between crab apples and regular apple trees, those crab apples will pollinate an apple tree, and they're actually really good pollinators because they tend to produce a lot of pollen. That's probably what's going on. Yeah. All right, let's do I don't know, I guess a 10-minute break, 5-10-minute break, and we'll get back to it. Be thinking of any questions, and if you guys want to, of course, discuss amongst yourselves, have at that, or use the bathroom, or whatever you need to do. I think I'm going to start back up again. We're going to go into a little bit of insects and disease right now. So we'll start off with that. This is a little bit more geared towards organic production, but the monitoring and threshold numbers that I'm going to give you guys is applicable to any kind of conventional orchard as well. So in a monitoring system, well, I guess first of all, kind of my objectives here is that you understand a little bit more about the common apple insect pests. What are the monitoring basics, the modeling basics, and what kind of control options you have. We'll do a little practice, and I'll mention a few resources as well. So this is the coddling moth. You can kind of see its grayish color. You can actually, one of I guess the first thing you'll notice about it, if you're trying to identify the coddling moth, is kind of that grayish, dark pattern on its wings. And then to kind of confirm that, what you'd look for is a bronzish color on the tips of the wings. So it'll be a little bit bright and shimmering. So that's the coddling moth, and on that apple there, you can see that it'll dig into that, and it will leave what they call frass. It's just kind of like a orangish kind of material that will be on the entrance wound there. Coddling moth is definitely an issue in this part of the state, and maybe to a little bit lesser extent up in your area. It might be not such a great issue, but it's but I think for all of these pests, it's important to monitor and see what's in your orchard and at your site. This is its life cycle. It will emerge in the springtime or early summer as an adult moth. It'll go in and start mating and laying eggs on the leaf surface. You'll have a hatch, and then the larvae will burrow into the fruit. They'll fall to the ground with the apple or on their own and kind of pupate in loose bark or debris there on the ground. And then either in the same year or in the following year, exit again. Probably in your area it might be just a one cycle per year, given the temperatures. But I think it's really cool how you can monitor for these insect pests. You can put a trap like this that's called a delta trap, and you've got a sticky paper material inside, and you'll also want to put up a pheromone, and that pheromone will attract females, and they will land on that sticky paper inside, and then you'll be able to tell what kind of pressure you're experiencing in your orchard or at your site. You want to hang them up in the tree about 6 to 7 feet tall, or at a height of 6 to 7 feet, preferably on the south side of the tree and on the inside of the canopy. And what you do with these traps is you'll actually, once you reach a threshold of 10, that's the economic threshold at which point you need to start considering taking some action. And as I said, it's an economic threshold, so we're not looking at the point at which there's some damage, but we're looking at a point at which that damage is causing you to lose any money, and it's time to invest in some sort of control in order to bring those numbers down a little bit. I don't know how big your screens are, but if you can see this chart at all, there's a straight line at 10, and then all the other lines are the counts for the orchard that I used to work at. So 10's the threshold, and you can see that some of the blocks go above that threshold at a number of different points. You generally, if you have a larger orchard, you want to break it up into blocks that are maybe 5 to 10 acres in size, and then you can do monitoring by block. So you might have multiple blocks, or 7 or 8 blocks, depending on the size of your production or the scale of your production. And for this one, I've just chosen a number of 4 different blocks, and actually in only 2 of them, and in 3 different instances, or 4 different instances, were the numbers over threshold. So what you see below that line at 10 is where you don't have to do anything, which is nice. First of all, you have time to do other things, and second of all, you're not spraying any kind of chemical, whether they be organic or synthetic, when it's not really necessary, when you don't have damage at a level that's causing you to lose money or production. So you can see that there's only a number of places or moments in time, and only a few different blocks that actually need to be sprayed in this year. Yeah.
Kirkson, we have one quick question. Is that okay?
Yeah, can you get close to a mic or something? I can just barely hear you.
Yeah. We have a question on a threshold of 10.
Yeah.
Is that per tree?
That's per trap and per block. So you have one of these delta traps somewhere towards the middle of your block, and once you reach 10 in that block, then you would want to take action in just that block. Thanks for that question. That wasn't very specific there.
How large of an area is a block?
So you'd probably want to do something between 5 and 10 acres.
Okay.
Yep. So if you just have your backyard orchard and you have a dozen trees, that's your block. All right, thanks for that. Getting into apple maggot. So this is the apple maggot on the left side there, and you can identify that through the wings. It has the black kind of striping, and it's in a W shape. The second thing you would look for is the white spot in the middle of its body on its abdomen, and its head is kind of a pinkish reddish, but that's sometimes a little bit difficult to see. So first look for that W in the wings and the white spot. There are some lookalikes that have a similar pattern on the wings in that black color, but they generally don't have the white spot or the full W shape. The center and right apples kind of show what can happen when you have the apple maggot damage, and below as well you can see where the apple maggot tried to lay some eggs or did lay some eggs. Their life cycle, again, they overwinter in the soil as pupae. They emerge as flies, and then they begin to lay eggs around 7 to 10 days after emergence, depending on the temperature. The maggots will emerge from eggs, feeding on the fruit, so that's your worm in your fruit. The larvae will remain in the apple for several weeks and then burrow into the ground once the apple falls. Apple maggot is, of course, an issue. You don't want worms in your apples. That's not fun at all. So apple maggot monitoring. There's a number of materials that you can use. So what you see here is just a plastic sphere that's red and covered in what they call tanglefoot. Tanglefoot is just a product that you can put on something like this that's incredibly sticky and make you wash your hands multiple times in order to remove it. You can use a number of different materials for the sphere. It could be a plastic red cup. It could be an actual apple. They sell spheres for this specific purpose. You could use an old croquet ball, anything that's round and relatively dark in the reddish color. Once you get that tanglefoot and a lot of apple maggots on them, I wish you luck in cleaning them. One rainy day towards the end of the season, boss man gave me the fun job of cleaning up these spheres, and tell you what, I was a mess at the end. It was bad, but and didn't even get all that clean. But you got to think, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're talking about apple maggots here. They're a little bit dumb, so it doesn't have to be a beautiful round red thing. They're just kind of looking for that general shape. Especially when you have the apple essence lure. These things can be found through some of the IPM sources out there. I think I mentioned, at the bottom of the handout there's an IPM supplier. There's a number of different places. I know that Great Lakes IPM has a lot of these different products, including the pheromones, Delta traps, and apple essence. You could probably get tanglefoot from them as well as at other places. I'm not endorsing any specific source, but that's one option, and they have a website. So when you do apple maggot monitoring, you're setting up 3 spheres, and you put them on 3 different borders. You're going to check all those borders, and if you have an average of 5 throughout, so anything that totals over 15 on your spheres, then you've reached the threshold. And these thresholds have been developed by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and I guess further information is, if you look at your resource sheet, towards the middle of the first page, the Integrated Pest Management Program has an incredible amount of information available online, as well as in print. They might have some things. So if you look at the IPM manual for Minnesota orchards, it's a very excellent guide. It's good for organic growers as well as conventional growers, and it has information on insect pests as well as disease. They've produced a field guide for identification of different pest insects, as well as beneficials for apple orchards. And then the fruit and vegetable IPM news, that's actually a listserv you can join to they'll report numbers throughout the state of insect counts as well as degree days, which you'll hear a little bit more in a few minutes. So that's a really good source of information. So like I said, threshold of the average of 15 on 3 spheres is when you might want to start taking some action. So there's just another graphical representation of insect counts on the orchard that I was working at. Again, you'll see, let's see, on 3 separate dates there were, it was above threshold, and actually in just 3 different blocks. So that's not a lot of time when you need to actually spray again, so you're saving money on that, on time as well as on materials. The next thing that is common insect pest in Minnesota orchards are the plum cuculio. It kind of looks like it's got a big nose. It's kind of got an elephant nose, and that's kind of the best way to identify it. It's a weevil, and if you see on the right there, that small apple has a crescent-shaped cut in it, and that is typical of what the plum curculio will do on a young apple. They're actually trying to cut it open and then lay an egg, but with apples they won't actually be able to. They'll lay an egg, but it won't be able to develop because the fruit is actually expanding quite rapidly. So they actually need a softer fruit in order to achieve any real reproduction. But the damage is there just the same. Again, that's another insect that overwinters in leaf litter. They emerge early in the summer. The eggs, if they do survive on a softer fruit, they develop into larvae and then go into the soil and then pupate. You'll have some emergence in August, but most of the damage generally occurs earlier in the summer. There's a more developed apple that has some scars from plum curculio. You can see that it's in a kind of a crescent shaped as well on there. So that lowers the value of your product. Also, having those incisions or holes in your apples is another opportunity for secondary diseases to enter, or just the fruit to start decaying in those areas. So it's not a good thing to happen to your apples. So I want to talk a little bit. I don't want to get too heavy into degree days, but when we talk about insect development, what really influences how they develop, how fast they develop, and at what stage they're at is degree days. Degree days can be kind of confusing. First off, I'll say you can have more than one degree day in an actual day. So, and it's most common to have multiple days depending on the temperature. I'll show you how you calculate degree days. So on any given day, you take your maximum temperature, you add your minimum temperature, you divide it by 2, and then you subtract it by a base temp. For most apple insect pests, you're using a base temperature of 50. So for example, if yesterday the high was 78, we're not in Florida or California, that's obviously why, but if it was 78 and the low was 63, how many degree days accumulated yesterday with a base temp of 50? So this is an exciting slide. So 78 plus 62 divided by 2 minus 50. You go down and you get 20 growing degree days. Now, that helps us know at what stage the insects are at. This might be a little bit advanced for some people. I just want to have a little bit of discussion on this for people that are more interested in a little bit more advanced production. And for example, I'll talk a little bit about, let's see. for different diseases, for example, for some of the insects, you want to hit them around 200 degree days. Like, for example, for some insects, we know that around 200 degree days, the eggs are going to be hatching that they have laid after emerging. So if I am calculating how many degree days I'm passing, I'll get a threshold. I'll meet a threshold one day, and from that point, I'm going to wait until I hit 200 degree days, and that's when I'm going to spray. I wait until that 200 degree days because, for example, I could spray spinosad, which is an option for organic growers, and that spinosad actually needs to be ingested by the insect in order to be effective. So if I spray it just before they hatch, those larvae actually need to chew through their egg. That spinosad's on their egg, they eat it, and then they die. So that's just kind of the goal. You're able to predict at what life stage the insects are at based on the degree days that have passed. So just to kind of summarize that a little bit, we can relax in parentheses as farmers when the economic thresholds haven't been met or exceeded. And we can wait until the insects are susceptible to our controls. So waiting until we have that right amount of degree day accumulation for our controls to be effective. We should do something when we're at an economic threshold again and when they are most vulnerable. And it will differ based on what control you're using. You know, some controls are for adults, some are when they're in that egg stage, like I was talking about. So you need to be thinking about all those issues. In general, we're not guessing so much. This is an example of a monitor that you can have out in the field. This is, you know, if you're a little bit more advanced, you might have one of these monitors on your site that records temperatures, so you can actually model the degree day accumulation based on the temperatures that are actually at your site. And then the kind of gold-plated zigzag thing on top of it is that actually measures leaf wetness, which we'll get into in just a few minutes as we start talking about diseases. If you're interested in this kind of integrated pest management that is a little bit more advanced, again, I recommend the MDA manual, and you definitely need to read a lot. This is the kind of thing that you hear about, and you're probably going to have a lot more questions that I'm going to be able to answer this evening. It's pretty complicated, so I'm just putting it out there. So talking about some non-spray controls or cultural methods that we can use in order to have good control of insects. First of all, having healthy trees that are well pruned with proper soil conditions, with thinning. In general, of course, as with any kind of production, we want to have healthy plants. So having that out there. Providing shelter and feed for beneficials is really important. Kind of the beneficials that are pretty much for any kind of crop are also beneficials for apples. So things like predatory spiders, some of the parasitic wasps, Asian beetles, those things will predate on some of the pests and eggs of the pests that are out there. I really want to stress the removal and destruction or destruction of fallen apples. If you have an orchard floor and you're able to do any raking and getting rid of them, and then composting them or doing something so that any kind of surviving larvae that no longer survives and is killed through that process, I think is really important. If you're on a scale that it's just not feasible to do that kind of work, having an active orchard floor in terms of the microorganisms that are there will really help. Some people will, apply a fertilizer even just to make sure that there's enough nitrogen out there so that more or less the apples that do fall are getting composted, as well as doing some sort of tillage or other practice like that. That will help integrate those apples into the soil and later get destroyed more or less. And then site selection, like I was talking earlier, not being around unmanaged trees, and of course in general just having healthy soils. Here's an example of some of the one thing that you can do in terms of providing a habitat and food for your beneficials. As you can see here, we've got on the far left there's a mowed row, in the center there's an unmowed row, and to the right there's a mowed row. So this is the orchard that I was working at, and what they're doing is doing alternate mowing. By doing this, you're providing habitat and shelter. You're allowing plants to grow until they flower, so that there's pollen and nectar available for insects that depend on that for their survival. So you've got predators out there that can fight against your damaging insects. It's maybe not that idyllic kind of beautiful manicured orchard that we might sometimes have in our minds, but I think it's an interesting way to improve on our integrated pest management. I'm going to go through this really quickly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on different products and how to apply them. It just gets to be an awful lot. So again, look at that IPM manual provided by the MDA. Cowling moth can be controlled through kaolin clay. It's just it's a clay that you spray on a tree and it paints it white. It's irritating to the insect and it actually messes with some of their visual cues. Granulosis virus goes under Sidex. Neem is another product that can be used. Mating disruption involves hanging hundreds of pheromones out in your orchard that mess up the reproductive cycle of the insects. This has to be done at a pretty large scale on a larger orchard. It's not really good for a smaller production. And then you can bag your apples. I don't know if any of you have seen anybody bag their apples, but you take a Ziploc bag or any kind of bag that you can close off, and around the end of June you take all your apples and you put a bag around them. And you've got a physical barrier. The apple's going to be able to grow inside that bag, and insects are not going to bother it. If you only have a few trees, this would be a reasonable method to use. You want to cut the corners of the bag so water can get out, so you don't get a little swimming pool for your apple in there. So that's kind of neat. Apple maggot, you can actually trap out quite a few apple maggots if you hang up a sphere that's the same as the one that I showed you prior. I'll get there. So you can hang these up all around your orchard, at least on three sides, or on the bordering where the orchard might border any kind of forest land or unmanaged area. Put it up every 15 feet. Have an apple essence lure and make sure that it remains sticky with your tanglefoot. That's actually a pretty effective method for apple maggot, and it's kind of a good first step in controlling them organically. Let's see. There's you can also use kaolin clay kind of as a second step. That also just messes with its visual cues and irritates it. Spinosad bacteria, which is sold under the name Entrust. And then there's organic pyrethroids or pyrethroids that are available as well. Both the Entrust and Pyganic are relatively broad spectrum, so using them on more than one in one season or repetitively could really create some resistance issues for those insects. Looking at plum curculio, this is kind of a little bit more difficult to monitor for. There's not a really great method for trapping them to see what your population is in the orchard. But you can do just kind of spot checks being out in your orchard and seeing if there is any damage, where that damage is, and you can actually you can beat on the trees and they will fall out. If you put a tarp on the bottom of the tree, then beat beat those plum curculios to death. That's one simple method. If you have fewer trees, you can do that. Sometimes poultry might help. Kaolin clay again is another option, and then thinning. Let them do their damage, and then remove the apples on which they've made that cut. But plum curculio is a little bit more tricky. I know that, like I said before, the insect presence up north might not be so prevalent as we have down here, but I think it's really important to be checking on your orchard and seeing what's out there, maybe having a few traps out just to see if you're catching anything. Again, talking with neighbors and seeing what they have and working on that. So with that, we'll go into the second exercise of activities that I provided. I've got some data there. You can just kind of look through that and kind of see at what point you would actually need to start looking at any kind of control. So on the left is a graph for apple maggot, and on the right is codling moth. Remember, apple maggot, the economic threshold is 15, and with codling moth, the threshold is 15 or 5 average for 3 spheres, and then the codling moth, the threshold is 10. So take a couple minutes just to look through there and try and find at what point you would actually need to start thinking about taking some action. So I'll give you a couple minutes. All right, we'll take a look at these different graphs. So if we look at the apple maggot, if you found that you would want to start looking at the 10th and 17th of July, those are really the only moments when you have a average of 5 throughout the spheres. So on the 10th, you have a count of 7, 5, and 8. That gives us a count of 20. Divided by 3 is over 5. And then on the 17th, we got a 5, 5, and a 6. So that's over 15 as well. And then we would base what we would do on probably degree days, as well as the different control that we might use. Hopefully, around the end of June, we would have put out apple maggot spheres traps in order to start trapping them before they start getting into our orchard, and that should have helped. If we look at codling moth, there are, from what I see, 3 different instances. Twice in block 2 on June 5th and June 12th when we're over 10, and then on June 5th in block 3 we're at 10, so that's our threshold, and we would again base our action on what kind of control we would use and hopefully degree days. If you look back on apple maggot, on the 10th, no, not on the 10th, but on the 14th of August, we have a count of 8 on the 3rd sphere, but we're not over threshold because it's not an average of 5 for the 3. So I will at this point take a few more questions. We kind of went through a lot with insects. Those are kind of the main ones that we want to look for. There's a few other minor pests that may or may not cause any damage, but like I said, they're minor and they're generally not a big issue. Again, you'll find more information with the MDA manual. So any burning questions out there?
Yeah, we have a couple in Bemidji.
Yeah, have at it.
So the first one is on these tables and on the graphs that you've given us, we can see that the population drops off again. Is
Yep.
that because there was control? Or
It's both because there was control as well as kind of just the life cycle of the insect.
okay,
They generally go in that kind of pattern in Minnesota.
okay. And then do you want to ask your question about mulch?
Yeah, I had a question. You know, if all three of these spend part of their life cycle in either the leaf litter or the soil, then especially if you have a smaller orchard, is there any value to spreading like diatomaceous earth around the base of your trees as an organic control in order to disrupt that part of their life cycle? Because they're soft-bodied at that point, so they would be more susceptible to the effects of diatomaceous earth.
That could be. That might be an option. I haven't, I guess, specifically heard of anybody doing that. Kind of any way you're able to, I guess, encourage any kind of microorganism activity or being able to more or less get rid of those insects is a good moment to do that. So it might. I guess I'm not completely sure. I'd want to look into that a little bit more. Good question.
Here's a question for Moorhead.
Yeah.
I've had some apples where when you cut it open, some of the seeds are soft, and you open up the seed, and inside is a worm. Is that the apple maggot?
Yes, it would most likely be the apple maggot.
I got a question here in Staples.
Yeah.
3 questions. I want to know about what you know about dormant sprays, and I want do you know anything about sooty blotch? And I was wondering about that clay, that kaolin clay. How hard is that to wash off?
I'm not completely sure what you're talking about with dormant sprays.
You see them in some of the garden catalogs. They say you spray in the spring of the year when it's still kind of cool and it's supposedly supposed to do some smothering of insects or their eggs. I'm not sure. That's why I was asking.
I guess I'm not familiar with that specific spray. I don't know if it has some sort of action that it's supposed to take. If it's a hormone or a pheromone that would mess with the development, or if it's some sort of, if it were nitrogen containing and would encourage microorganism activity. I'm not completely sure what their action would be. Sooty blotch. I'll talk a little bit about sooty blotch. That's a summer disease, and sometimes needs control, but otherwise, sooty blotch you can often wash off or clean off through that process. And then kaolin clay, it'll generally stay on the tree for a few weeks depending on the rain, and generally not a huge issue, but it cleans off pretty well. It's not hard to get it off the apple if you were to need to apply any of the kaolin clay at the end of the season when the apples are on there. So it comes off.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
As a practical application in the orchard you worked on, you go through the apples and harvest in the fall, and you pick the really nice ones to sell as fresh apples or market those apples, and then you always have a few that are damaged. Maybe they've got a couple of insects or whatever. Are you making Applejack or wine or anything out of those, or are they just going to waste?
What we did is we were grading out the apples in premium and second grade apples. So we'd sell your USDA #1 apple for a higher price, and then we'd take the seconds, which some farms actually don't market, but we'd take those and sell them for a reduced cost, but they're organic, so they're still getting a pretty decent price. And then we made a lot of cider, a lot of fresh cider, as well as applesauce. We weren't doing any of the Applejack, experimenting a little bit with hard cider, but that's a really good question. Finding ways to use those apples that you can't market as fresh eating apples is really important to kind of keeping the value up in the orchard. So those are definitely really good ideas of things to do with the apples that can't go to that fresh market. Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any what the food regulations are for that? If you're doing the applesauce or you're doing the cider, what regulations are there so you can sell that retail?
You would need I'm not 100% on this, but you need a inspection by the MDA in order to do that generally if you're selling at retail, and you need to set up kind of food safety plans and have a kitchen that is licensed. But yeah, you definitely, there restrictions apply. Other questions?
Jake, this is Sarah from Crookston. Can I ask Linda Kinnery in Bemidji, can you just mention the kitchen the community kitchen that's going to be starting soon?
Yeah, in Bemidji here, the Harmony Food Co-op, which is a consumer-owned co-op downtown, has recently put together a commercial kitchen that's available to people to use on a kind of rent the facility by the hour. So it has those. It's a commercially certified kitchen, and they will also. I just learned yesterday they're also going to be doing the Serve Safe course here in a couple of weeks. So especially people here who might be interested in that, in using that kitchen, you can also get the Serve Safe training, which I think costs about $20 to actually take the test, but they aren't charging more for the course. Might be of interest. And I'll post some more information about that on the localfoods.umn.edu/college webpage.
Great. I think I'm going to get back into it. I want to make sure that I get through all my material and we're able to leave a little bit more time for questions. So I'll keep moving through here. I want to talk a little about mammals. They can be quite damaging, especially deer. I don't know what the populations are up there right now, but down in this area, they're pretty damaging. They tend to like a young tree. The new growth off of a sapling is quite appealing to a deer. So they can really, if you're trying to start an orchard and you've got all these young trees and you've got these deer that are browsing out there and constantly eating your new growth, it becomes rather difficult to be productive as an orchard. So there's a number of different ways to combat the deer. In the 2 years that I spent at the orchard, most of my early spring and late fall was spent putting up a 10-foot woven wire fence, which is doing well, actually. There's a number of different designs. I know that some people do an angle fence, and that's about 5 feet tall and angled out, and supposedly that kind of works. It doesn't work that well, I can say. That's what the orchard where I worked previously had, and deer, they'd just learn and they'd get through, and it was electrified and all of that, but it just wasn't really working. So we decided to throw up a 10-foot fence and use that as a barrier. And that's kind of one of the best options you have if you're able to spend the money on that, and if you like digging holes for posts. Another option is to use repellent. There's a number of repellents, both available for conventional growers as well as organic growers, that are generally made up of blood meal and a mix of eggs and all these wonderful things, and it's not great to, I guess the deer don't like it for some reason. They don't like to eat blood and eggs mixed together on a tree, and the odor is quite strong. So that's an option. If you do decide to use repellent, you need to apply it regularly. We were having some decent luck applying it to some of our younger trees every 2 weeks or so, 10 days to 2 weeks. And that was working more or less. So if you're going to use a repellent, again, apply it regularly, or you can get a hunting permit. The DNR actually has options for permits. If you have a farm that you can demonstrate has been damaged because of deer browsing, there's a program where they can give out permits, and people can come in and shoot the deer. As the farmer, I think there's some regulations on the number. I don't even know if the owner can actually take any deer, but the DNR does have a program. They also have a deer program with the fence. They will actually do some cost sharing on that. So probably your best bet is to call your local DNR person or visit their website to find further information on that. As I mentioned a few times, rodents are a big problem as well. They will girdle a tree. They'll eat through that first layer on the tree trunk, and they'll just kill the tree. So the tree guard is an option, and that helps a little bit, but they can still get through that sometimes. One of the best things you can do is keep the area around the tree sod free. So if there's no grass and it's just dirt, it's not a very good habit for any mice or voles, and they're not going to spend much time there. Also, having that area free of grass and whatnot, it's pretty open, so any kind of predator can see mice or vole quite well if it's all open. One of the things I'll mention, I'll find a picture of it for you quick. If you do have girdling on your tree, it's not dead forever. You can actually save that tree through bridge graft. Oh darn it. I'll get there. Just a second. So a bridge graft is what you can use if the tree has been girdled like this. You can see that around it all that first layer has been chewed out, and no water is going to be passing through that vascular tissue anymore. And you can actually take some wood for grafting and just bridge those two areas. So you make a cut down below and you make a cut up above. You seal it in, and you can save the tree. It's actually somewhat difficult to do, but it's better than losing your tree. So that's an option. I'll get into a little bit more grafting after this section. If you have some dogs on your land, they can help that, or if you like herding cats, get your herd of cats out there and they can do the work. There's also, if you're all right using poisons, that's an option. I've actually seen, I think there's some product out there where people are more or less putting propane into the ground and just kind of setting up a bomb in there, which brings us back to Caddyshack. But so mammals are a big issue. And these are some of the things that you can do for those. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on diseases, especially scab, fire blight, and cedar apple rust. Apple scab is probably the most prevalent fungal disease or disease of apple trees that it is in Minnesota. It's a little bit less of an issue up in your area. Of course, you're going to want to monitor for it and try and employ any controls that you need to if it becomes an issue. I'll talk a little bit more about that. There's a few summer diseases. Someone was talking about sooty blotch earlier. There's also fly speck, which can get on your apples. I don't worry as much about summer diseases, especially if you're producing for yourself or you have a forgiving customer base. They don't always really need a control. You can clean them off, or fly speck is not super damaging and you can eat it and it's fine. I would recommend the U of M publication on integrated pest management. Again, I'll repeat the MDAs. The U of M publication is more for home apple growers. That's the first link that I provide on the resources. That has a lot of information, both on insects as well as disease. So apple scab, this is what it looks like on the leaves and on the apple. It's got a kind of a life cycle including different fruiting bodies and different action. The really cool thing about apple scab is they've studied it quite a bit, and if you're looking to grow at a large scale, at a commercial scale, you can do a lot of monitoring for it that will allow you to make spray decisions only when you have the possibility of an infection. So this is what is called the Mills table. On the left, you have hours of leaf wetness. If you remember, I showed you that little contraption with the zigzaggy panel on the top. That's something that you can use to measure leaf wetness. That just shows you how long a typical leaf on the apple tree is going to be wet for. And then you're monitoring for temperature, which is on the x-axis below. And if you see here, you've got 3 levels of infection that can occur. And you'll see that as temperature increases, the number of hours that you need of leaf wetness, it goes down. So right around that 65 to 70 degrees, if you have 3 or 4 hours of leaf wetness, it's likely that you have a apple scab infection. And then after that infection period or during that infection period, you're going to want to employ any kind of control that you might be using. There's also some protectants that can be applied. This might be if you've got a very high value apple that is on your farm that you really want to have those high quality number ones. You might do a protectant and a post-infection spray as well. I will say that with organic production, both the protectant as well as the post-infection options are there, but you need to be a lot more timely with those. With any synthetic sprays, they allow a much longer time to pass between the infection period and the moment at which it's too late to act. So again, looking at that graph, you can see if it's say 45 degrees, you actually need a very long period of wetness on your leaves, up to right around that 30-hour mark. And hopefully you've got your well-pruned orchard, maybe the wind's moving a little bit, you've got your air drainage, and those leaves aren't going to be wet for that long. But this allows us, just as the insect IPM, is to employ those controls when we really actually need it and when there is an actual infection in our orchard. So that's the Mills table, and that's apple scab. Again, with apple scab, one of the things that I'll again stress is that if you can mow your orchard or your site once the leaves have fallen off the trees, that will help incredibly. That will eliminate the inoculum or the primary scab infection, those fruiting bodies that in the spring expel spores that in turn infect leaves. So eliminating and destroying those leaves on the ground is a great step that you can take. Again, as I said, with some of these insects and diseases, it's not as great of an issue up in northern Minnesota, but it's definitely still an issue. So as I said, get ready destroying that leaf litter, spraying based on the infection period. I'll repeat, there's those resistant varieties that are out there that are apple scab resistant, that despite an infection period, they won't get apple scab, so those are excellent options. And again, it may not be a huge issue where you are, but again, you want to be monitoring for it because it can get in there. Fire blight is a bacteria. It's either controlled through pruning with sanitation or through the use of some antibacterial sprays. Copper is an option, as well as Serenade is a product name. If you do see fire blight in your orchard, and it might be a little bit grainy, but the photo on the left just shows dieback in your tree. That's the end of the branches are, the leaves are falling off. It's just kind of a sad looking branch. That could be fire blight. And then on the right, you'll see those leaves are looking like they've got a little bit of a crook in it. That's also a sign of fire blight. So again, if you see this and you see branches that are exhibiting fire blight, pruning is important, removing those infected branches. And I really want to stress that if you are pruning a fire blight infected tree, that you, as you're using it, you need to be sanitizing it with bleach. So dipping those pruners in some bleach will disinfect them, and you won't be passing it on to other parts of the tree or other trees that may be healthy in your orchard. And then with that debris, that the stuff that you prune, either burn it or get rid of it in some way. There's also varieties that are either more susceptible or resistant to fire blight, and rootstock can also have an effect on fire blight resistance. So choosing those varieties wisely will definitely help you out as well. I'm going to go in a little bit to grafting. I just want to talk kind of briefly about it. Get set up here. There's a number of different grafts that people can use, and grafting is a good way to propagate any kind of particular variety that you want to use and expand its use. I will mention that some varieties have certain patents or trademarks or are registered, and being able to just take wood off of a tree and graft a bunch of those trees is not always legal. You might need to pay for those propagation rights, but for other varieties you're able to do it freely. This is a saddle graft. This first photo that you see here, this is kind of a pretty common graft that people use in bench grafting. So you're doing it probably in the spring before planting, and you're again just attaching those rootstocks and your scion wood together. This is a pretty effective way. It would be then there's some grafting glue that can put around it, as well as tape. There's specific tapes and grafting glue, so make sure that you use those. Here's a cleft graft. This is a little bit easier, I'd say. You're just sticking the scion wood into the rootstock, as you can see in the picture there. Whip and tongue is probably the most complicated and difficult, but the thing with a whip and tongue is that it has a lot of contact between the two different plant parts that you're using. And what you really want with a graft is you want both of your wood in general, especially for the whip and tongue, as well as the saddle graft, to be of the same diameter more or less, because you want them to match up in their vascular tissue. If water and food can't be flowing through them, it's not going to work, and you're not going to have a successful graft. This is a top graft. This is an example of a tree that I worked on this past, I guess it would have been early spring. This is around bloom time. So at some time, you may have a bunch of trees out there that you don't want anymore. Rather than ripping them up, one option that you have is to do a top graft, and you're essentially just putting a new variety on that rootstock that's already developed all the roots and everything. And so this is kind of a nice way of changing your trees and not losing that root structure. This is relatively easy to do. I talked about the bridge graft. Yeah. So that's, I mean, grafting gets kind of difficult. It takes some practice, but if you have the right tools and a little bit of hands-on experience, I think it's just about anybody can do it. I will say, don't cut yourself. I'm going to keep going. Let's see what time it is. About a quarter after. I don't have too much left. I'll be done with this pretty soon. Marketing options. You've got your farmers markets are great places. As I hear up north, you guys are expanding and building on that, so that's a good place to go. There's retail. You could set up your own apple stand on the side of the road or in town. There's the wholesale market. The wholesale market can be a little bit difficult depending on your product. Having a high quality product that is able to meet the standards of grocers is sometimes difficult. It is a little bit easier, I think, if you have an organic product that people are a little bit more forgiving of a little bit of fly speck or not the most beautiful apples on the tree. So there's an option. CSAs, you could do a fruit CSA or possibly sell wholesale to CSAs so that they can include it in their vegetable CSA. I've heard of people doing kind of a CSA model, but I think it was out in Michigan. I heard of an orchard that was you could adopt a tree for a year, and you'd get all the apples off of that tree, and they pay a yearly rate, and that's kind of a neat option. And then there's U-Pick. Of course, with any U-Pick kind of operation, get to know your insurance agents very well, and I hope you like people. Just to kind of reiterate on the value added, you've got cider, you've got hard cider. I don't know if anybody's seen in a bar how much organic hard cider sells for, but it's kind of ridiculous. There's apple sauce, you've got apple pie. There's an orchard right around my area in Winona that throughout the apple season they're baking, I don't know, hundreds of pies a day. I don't know. It's crazy. There's apple butter. You've got dried apples. You can use apples to make jelly. And as I alluded to earlier, it can be a moneymaker for apples that aren't able to be sold as fresh market or fresh eating apples. So there's a lot of options out there. Please be creative. I personally prefer apple crisp over apple pie. That's just me. I think it's easier to make. Maybe I'm not an American. I'll talk a little bit about budget considerations. Actually, if you're really looking at getting deep into a budget, Michigan State University has a fantastic cost of production that they developed, and you can play with this an awful lot, and it's got some numbers built in that you can adjust. You can see on this first leaf here, you can look at your labor costs, so you can adjust that on an hourly rate of those things. I don't know if this shows up for everybody, but it's got everything from tree guards are in there. You can factor in your spacing. It's got mowing costs, irrigation costs, fertilizer, trellis is on there somewhere. That's not just a blank page, but it kind of just compares the different trellis systems and how much that might cost you. Training, based especially on material costs, but also the labor costs and the hours per acre that might take you to do. So you can play with this an awful lot and put in numbers that apply to you and local costs. So if you like Excel sheets, this is a fantastic one that could really help a beginning apple orchard that's looking to go a little bit larger scale and wants to know what kind of costs that it might have. There's some other ones that are a little bit more simple that just kind of break down the returns by year and looking at when you might actually see any marketable production. I know Penn State has some information on that might be helpful. But I think that the MSU one is really good. I think that I at least put the Michigan State University apple page on there. So that was a quick budget talk. So other considerations, you need to be thinking about what kind of equipment you might need. If you're going to have an orchard that you need to spray, are you going to use a backpack? Are you going to have a pull behind sprayer? Bins? What are you going to pick into? I think it can be kind of a black box, the whole picking process. Where I was picking, and I think what people generally do is you pick into a picking bucket that you put on, I guess, hang on your shoulders, and then you put into a large bin that holds around 20 bushels. Those are for apples that are less easily bruised. If you have a variety that bruises easily, especially an apple like Zestar is an apple that bruises quite easily, especially in those warmer summer months. Picking straight into a bushel box is sometimes a better option, just because they won't bruise so easily being moved around. How are you going to grade your apples? Are you going to have any kind of equipment that sorts the apples? Are you going to clean them? Do you have cooler space? Are you interested in integrating animals into your operation? I spoke a little bit about having poultry and how that can help in terms of plum curculio populations. Where I was working, we also had the second year we started flash grazing pigs in the orchard, which was a fun experiment, and the idea being there that they would provide some nitrogen to the trees and help those apples rot a little bit faster, and also eat the fallen apples and kind of kill any larvae that might be in them. So that's something you might think about, especially again, if you're an organic grower, you need to be thinking about how are you going to manage those animals and any manure that might be getting into the field and possibly onto the trees. And again, I think it's always important to go over these things with your certifier if you're an organic grower, and figure out how you can do it and if you can do it. I want to talk a little about picking apples. I don't know how many people have really picked apples, and if you ever get those apples and you see up on the collar, it's got that little indentation. I didn't know before, but what that indentation is where somebody grabbed that apple and they pulled too hard. They didn't pick it right. It's a finger bruising. So when you're picking apples, you want to be gentle. And when you pick an apple is generally based on the color and the flavor. Most or a lot of orchards will color pick, so you're looking for your variety to be maybe 50% red or 75% red or 100% red, and it kind of depends on the apple and how it tastes and how that color influences it. And then the real scientific test is to smack the side of the tree and see how many apples fall off. If it's too many for what you care, start picking them, because if you get a strong wind and the apples are at the point where they're ready to simply fall off the tree, which is natural at some point, you want to get those apples off the tree before they're on the ground. In Minnesota, you can't actually market any apple that has been on the ground. I think in Wisconsin you're able to pick up drops and use it for cider or possibly other processing, but in Minnesota you can't. So obviously picking them before they get on the ground is important. Just some final notes. I just want to reiterate the importance of site selection and not planting in a low spot, trying to meet those ideals that are out there, and hopefully experimenting if you're able to. Always looking to hardiness in terms of the cultivars that you're using, as well as the rootstocks that you're employing on your operation. Again, choose varieties and rootstocks based on your needs. If you're happy with a apple scab resistant variety, and there are some of those that are really quite good, way better than a Red Delicious. Those are available, and I think if you just want to eat them yourself, it's a good option. I'm sorry if anybody likes Red Delicious out there. I just don't like Red Delicious. So monitor for your insects as well as for your diseases, and apply controls when you need, and eat up those apples. They're good for you. Let's see. I wanted to cover a few things that were mentioned at the beginning. I think that one of the questions was if you have an apple seed from an apple, and if you can just plant that. Yes, you can just plant it, but it's not going to be true. As we mentioned, most of the apples out there are crosses, so they're hybrids, and you're going to get something that is different from the apple that you ate, and it's going to grow to a full-size tree, and that will delay your harvest, as well as it's just hard to pick a full-size tree. It's not always fun to be up on a ladder. You can fall. It's just in general a pain, and I really like picking at short apple trees. I think I covered a fair amount of what's available for organic production. If there's any further questions about that, I'm happy to answer. We talked a fair amount about the benefits of dwarf apple trees. I was at a farm visit, and there was an orchard that had decided to plant standard sized trees, and they wanted to do it. They wanted to be a nice place, and they kind of wanted to be more of a kind of integrating the idea of agritourism and farm visits. And a full-size apple tree can be pretty, and I understand that it might fit into some production, but if you want the fruit, grow fruit and not trees. We talked a fair amount about winter imagery, using those tree guards to presenting the sun scald, having the right orientation on your land will help in that, and then of course choosing the hardiness of your variety as well as your rootstock. Let's see. Talk about fire blight. Let's see if there's any resources on here that are of use that I didn't mention. Again, Penn State's got some good information. Michigan State. Those are both other universities that are producing some interesting research, and they have a lot of that posted on their website. Throughout the growing season, some of them have updates on what's going on out there that might be of interest to you. The Organic Tree Fruit Association is a group in the United States that kind of shares information. It's an association. It's member-based. You can join. They have a listserv that you can sign up for, and people post questions and answers to that. They've got a fair amount of resources on their webpage. Full disclosure, my former boss is the president of that group, so I know about it through them, and I've received a lot of their publications, and I find them to be of use and quite informative, so I've included it on there. For any apple grower, I think, be they organic or conventional, Michael Phillips, The Apple Grower, is a really good book that goes way more in depth than this talk has, and will provide you with a lot more very helpful information about how apple trees grow, how to harvest, different varieties and different considerations. So I think that's a really good book. He's got a new book out on kind of holistic health and using a number of biocontrols and bioactivation in order to maintain a healthy orchard. I'm happy to be able to participate in his training coming up prior to the Moses Conference this week. So I kind of wish I was talking after that training, but I think he's done some really interesting things, and his work is a little bit more based towards the home orchard. If you're interested in pollination and pollinator issues, the Xerxes Society has excellent fact sheets and guides for improving the habitat for pollinators. The APTRA, or the National Center for Appropriate Technology, produced a pretty good webinar that's on YouTube, so that's available. And I mentioned the last two. So I'll take the rest of the time to answer any questions people might have. I know I talked about a lot of different stuff. I hope that I really should have created more questions in your minds than I answered. But I hope that through all the resources I have here, you'll be able to find anything that I didn't cover. So, any questions out there?
I have a difficulty raising Honeycrisp apples. They die on me. Have you got any suggestions? Or I only grow about a half a dozen trees, but a way to get them. What can I do to protect those trees to get them to get through the winter?
Have you been putting tree guard on them? The white tree guard that goes around the base of the tree. You've been using that?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
Lately, I didn't at first, but I am now.
Okay. And where's your site? Where are you located?
Well, I'm Thief River Falls.
Okay. And do you happen to know what the rootstock was on that?
I don't know.
Okay. I would look for Honeycrisp that is on not the B9, and I think that it's done poorly up in that area on M7 as well, so I would not choose B9 or M7. Look for B118, and this may or may not be the issue. I would look for possible issues with fire blight. Make sure that you don't have fire blight out there, and if you do get, if you need to remove the trees and burn them and maybe look for a different site, that might be an option. I would look for, try the either B118, Columbia crab. Those would be good options for Honeycrisp. I'd try that.
I got a question from Staples.
Yeah.
I put in 4 Honeycrisp, and 2 of them came up and did well. And the same year, last year, 2 of them budded out and started shooting inch-long shoots, and then they just died off, and then they were dripping red juice out of them. Did they rot, or?
That's more than likely fire blight. Actually, you probably have fire blight on your site.
How come the other 2 wouldn't be affected?
Pardon?
How come the other 2 were only like 15 feet away? Why wouldn't they be affected?
It doesn't spread all that easily. Most of the spreading is due to mechanical means,
Okay.
so pruning and moving from one to another and not cleaning. So prune those trees out. There's a couple of sprays that you can apply that might be helpful. The timing of those sprays is important. I think you need to be spraying around green tip. Further information on fire blight management is in the MDA manual. I'd look into that and look at some photos online or in any kind of books you can find on apple diseases, just to kind of confirm that it was fire blight. Bacterial diseases will kind of create an ooze, and that sounds like what you're describing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Another
Other
question
questions?
from Staples. How long do you expect a tree to last approximately, for years? Or, like you talked about pruning or adding a new tree to old roots, basically, but how long would you expect those roots, I guess how long is apple tree would last?
It can, a few decades. I know where I was working, there were some standard trees that were probably, maybe 40 years old. Those were standard. For dwarfed trees, I think, it kind of depends on your conditions, but I would say maybe 20 years wouldn't be unreasonable. Just treat it nicely. Other questions?
Are cedar apple rust spreads?
How does cedar apple rust spread?
Yeah, from a red cedar that has those blobs.
So the fruiting bodies actually come off of the cedar tree, and if you've ever seen a cedar tree with these kind of, they look like aliens. They're orange in color. They're kind of like all these fingers come out of the tree, and it actually they come off of the cedar tree and they spread to the apples. So that's why you want to remove the cedar trees from the area if you can. And
how far can it spread?
I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure how far those spores can travel. I mean, at least within the immediate vicinity would be helpful. Cedar apple rust isn't a major disease for most varieties, and it won't cause a lot of damage. But having those cedar trees that are at least closest to the area where you're trying to produce is definitely going to be helpful.
Is that any kind of cedar tree, or?
It's a red cedar.
Okay.
And question 2 on wasps. Do they make holes in aromatic apples, or are they just going after holes in
They
dirt?
tend to. I've actually been stung by quite a few wasps picking apples. So be careful of wasps. I guess they tend to find apples that have been damaged either by, like a cottling moth or apple maggot, and there's already a hole, so they'll find those holes and they'll start sipping apple juice out of those. But they don't tend to be damaging. Wasps, especially parasitic wasps, can be very good for your orchard in terms of they will predate on some of the insects that you don't want there. So wasps tend to be all right. Just don't let them sting you. Further questions?
Does the fire blight resistant rootstock, does it protect the crown as well as the rootstock from fire blight?
Yep. To some degree, if you have a very susceptible variety, that resistance will not be complete. But if you have that are resistant, you're in your, that's a best case scenario.
On the first night, the site leader gave me a sheet on polyculture regarding apples.
Yep.
And I'd like to hear something about that, the beneficial results of having alpine strawberry, wild indigo, daffodil, comfrey planted right around your tree.
Yeah, there's some of the research on that is not exactly clear, and I would encourage any kind of experimentation that you can do. I know I have heard that having alliums, any garlic or onions below your tree can prevent apple scab. I guess in general, having any kind of grass or flower or anything that's producing pollen or nectar is great. And if that kind of extends and is available to insects for a longer period of time, I think that is good for the beneficial insects that you want around. But I mean, you look into those guilds and those polyculture options and give it a try, see what happens. I guess it's interesting. Anything else out there?
I thought of one more question. I've been using wood chips as a mulch, but I've got a red sorrel problem, little weed that creeps along. And do you have any idea what I can do about that?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you all that well. Can you get closer to a mic, please?
I don't know where the mic is, but you know what red sorrel is?
Red sorrel?
Yeah, a weed.
Okay.
What would you use for controlling that in your apple trees? Probably got in with the wood chips.
Yeah, that might have been. If you can do any kind of cultivation, if you're interested in using any herbicides, there might be some options there. But cultivation might be a good option. Otherwise, throw some more mulch on there and choke them out. Other questions? I don't know, Linda, are we over time now, or how are we doing?
We're getting close to the end, I think.
Okay.
But I think if people get their questions answered.
Two more questions and more head.
Yeah.
I've heard of like a apple tree that hasn't been producing for a long time. It's planted and hasn't produced, like going out and beating it up with a baseball bat. Is there anything to that?
It'll definitely, if you have any aggression built up inside of you, it's be therapeutic in some ways. I can see if you have a tree that hasn't been producing or is unmanaged and is just not producing any apples, it's probably more related to or similar to pruning. You're kind of reinvigorating that apple tree, kind of stimulating further growth. So what probably happens if you smack a tree around a bunch is a similar effect to pruning, and you're essentially causing wounds on the tree that will encourage it to try and grow and heal itself. So I don't know that I'd take the baseball bat, but I might take some loppers out there and do a little pruning to kind of invigorate a tree like that.
Regarding pollination, if you've got two varieties that aren't self-fertile,
yeah.
How are they able to fertilize each other?
So they're not self-fertile, but they will receive pollen from another variety. It's just kind of a genetic thing, somewhat understood, but that's just the way it works. And most apple trees are self-infertile. There's a few varieties, like I said, that will pollinate themselves. But yeah, they I don't know if I could give a really good explanation on the spot of the whole mechanism that works there, but let's just take comfort in that it works. Sorry. Other questions?
Yeah, Jake, just a question on the pigs and the incorporation into the orchard.
Yeah.
I know at the fall conference you were talking about them rubbing up against the trees and rooting against and around the trees and incorporating their own manure into the ground.
Yeah.
Is there going to be some sort of evaluation next year to see if the trees come back more vigorous? Or are you guys going to do anything with that to see what happens and how the pigs affected the trees?
We definitely took records of where they were primarily, where they were at for periods of time, and well, there was one block that we were experimenting some different spraying techniques that are a little bit kind of out there and on the fringe, and so we definitely tried to make the pigs present out there just to see if, in combination with the spraying that was being done and their removal of any inoculum through apples or providing that nitrogen to disintegrate any leaves faster would help it out. Any kind of super rigorous kind of data collection or anything probably isn't really happening, but more of a, hopefully we'll have some anecdotal results from it. It'll be really interesting to see. With the pigs, it was the labor part was somewhat time consuming, but it was kind of neat. They loved it out there, of course, but they ate a lot of grass. I saw some pigs tearing apart some thistles a few times, which I can't hardly believe, but they did pretty well. And I'll tell you, we butchered one pig. We butchered a number of pigs on the farm and immediately put them in the smoker the same day. And the rib off of that pig was one of the best pieces of meat I've had. Maybe because I was just so happy to have one less pig on the farm than I had. Either way, it was really good.
Jake and Bemidji here, we have participants who have pigs in their orchard.
Yeah, great. How's it going?
Well, we haven't run them yet because our orchard is just beginning, but that's our plan is to run them.
Cool.
Yep.
Very cool. Make sure you get some good fencing.
Oh yeah, electric
Get 'em
fencing's
trained.
great.
Get them trained real hard.
We have pastured them up to this point. We just haven't
Okay.
run them in the orchard yet, so we have experience with pasturing the pigs, and that can be a challenge.
Yeah, I wish you luck. I hope it works out. It's a great idea, and it's fun. It's fun to see those pigs out there rooting around in the soil. And we actually, we were using the weed badger, and they actually, they'd be out there in the grass, but they really rooted around well around the trees. They didn't do a lot of damage. So as long as you're able to have a good fence and make it work in terms of time on your orchard, I think it could be really great. They're delicious too.
Yeah, they are.
Well, if that's all the questions, let's thank Jake for a really great presentation here.
Thank you guys. Very good questions. Good luck with your apples.
Be sure you put together your evaluations and leave them with your site host. And next week we do berries and small fruits. So see you next week. Thank you.